Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marko, and like Andrea said, I'm at the Goldman School of Public Policy. And so I want to briefly just talk about, many of you might not know who Roma are, so I want to give you a brief history, but also what the term you might know is gypsy. And gypsy is a derogatory term, and I will not be using it throughout my presentation because of that. And so I want to take you through a brief history of Roma. Roma are a unique identity group that left India around the first millennia. They arrived to Europe around the 12th century. Ever since they arrived in Europe, they've been enslaved for 500 years. They've been persecuted, discriminated, segregated, experienced genocide, experienced cultural genocide as well. And currently, today, still, they're experiencing segregation and discrimination and other forms of oppression. So I am Roma. And this is actually a big statement because a lot of Roma do not self-identify. So in surveys, Roma will actually not self-identify because they're afraid that it will be used against them from outside institutions. So now, in terms of the project that I did over the summer, I had the privilege to work with Harvard University's FXB Center for Health and Human Rights on a project called Roma Adolescents. So Roma Adolescents used a participatory action research model. And so this ties directly into what some of the current themes have been doing of how to try to bridge research and advocacy. And so the participatory action research model took 10 Roma students and 10 non-Roma students in Belgrade, Serbia, in a community in Belgrade, Serbia, to implement this research project. And these adolescent researchers were involved in all the process of the research, all the way from designing the research question to creating the surveys, to implementing interviews, to analyzing interviews, and then also to implementation of the data. So some of the main project goals were for these Roma and non-Roma adolescent researchers to become leaders, to become change agents within their community. But in addition, to generate data for them to be able to use for actual action on the ground and to create social change. So the research question that they came up with was obstacles around education, but also what are their aspirations and expectations for other Roma and non-Roma within this community about their education. This is also, they interviewed Roma parents and non-Roma as well within the community. So what is the current narrative in Central and Eastern Europe about why there's poor outcomes among the educational outcomes among Roma in Roma communities? So some of the narrative is that Roma are disinterested in education, that children are victims of a tradition that doesn't value education, and that culture generally does not value the education. The bias goes even deeper than this. In a communication retrieved from the the Ministry of Education in Slovakia, the minister said that Roma, because of their genetics, cannot be educated. In the context of this email, was stating that all the programs that they're doing for integration and desegregation were not going to be working because inherently they won't be able to be educated. So my role over the summer was I was in Boston and working remotely, but in contact with these Roma and non-Roma adolescent researchers and other Roma leadership on the ground in Serbia. And my role was to help analyze some of the data, go through some of the qualitative data with the adolescent researchers, but then also, currently right now what I'm doing is to work with them on a advocacy plan to include anti-bias training and cultural competency training within that local school district. So I want to show you just some of the results from the research that really counters some of that narrative that I discussed earlier. So over 50% of Roma interviewees desired careers obtaining high school education or vocational training. But when we look at this correlating with experience of discrimination, we see a different story. And what we see is that adolescents who experience discrimination are over 60% less likely to aspire to have a career requiring education, higher education, compared to youth who have not experienced discrimination. So in addition, these adolescent researchers interviewed Roma parents about their aspirations and expectations for their own children to again counter this narrative. So one Roma parent said, education provides easier employment. I do not want my kids to be like me. Another parent said education is important, especially for Roma community, because if we want improvement in our community, we need to be educated. In addition, these adolescent researchers interviewed non-Roma on the perceptions of discrimination. And here we can see some of the ingrained bias within the community. So one non-Roma individual said it is important that all children have equal rights. Roma children have a lot of benefits, free food, free snacks, books, and so on. But this does not mean that, does not have a maximum impact because parents of these students are not interested in the education of their children. Sorry. And then one teacher, non-Roma teacher, stated that their peers discriminate against them, teachers treat them differently than other students, employers are not willing to employ them. So briefly, I want to go through some of the main outcomes. This is also directly related to the main project goals. And that was development of empathy and respect for diversity. And this is because the 10 non-Roma and 10 Roma adolescent researchers worked in pairs on the research project. And we had a diary where they were recording some of their experiences, and they really got to acknowledge each other's differences and appreciate their differences, and to really kind of see a different perspective on each other's groups. But then also to improve this aspect of identity, personal exploration, and self-esteem. But I think the two most important parts of the main outcomes of this project were improved understanding of the mechanisms that maintain inequality and discrimination, but then also strong commitment to advocate for social justice and equity. So what I wanted to kind of propose is how does participatory action research actually create sustainable change within the Roma community? And here's when I kind of want to leave you or just introduce a quote. This quote says, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So in terms of the Roma context, now these adolescent researchers, both the Roma and non-Roma, understand the mechanisms of this oppression. The non-Roma understand their own superiority and the community's own superiority, and they can break down that kind of method of oppression as well. And then also Roma, now understanding the mechanisms, have a way to protect themselves from this oppression and able to really kind of fight back. But now in terms of using these tools, what the Roma adolescent researchers and Roma community members can do is actually take control of these tools. And then through a cultural and community lens, shape those tools into something that's completely different to really advocate for social change. And I think with these two main aspects, then we can actually see genuine change within the Roma community. Thank you.